a lot of business observers just assume that AI progress is going to happen like in a very linear way, but in reality, AI progress happens in lumps.
Hello. Welcome to Term Sheet. I'm Allie Garfinkel, and this is the podcast where we talk about the weird world of private capital, tech, and startups. Now, we're undoubtedly in for another year of chaos in the private markets, and of course, a key source of that chaos is going to be, you guessed it, AI. But our guest this week is someone who has a very unique perspective on it. Jenny Xiao is the founder of Leonis Capital, and Jenny is a former OpenAI researcher turned VC. She has a very academic lens on AI, and she is a person who really understands the international landscape. When I want to understand AI in China, I go to Jenny, and I'm really excited to bring her to all of you. Before we get to Jenny, we need to talk about Sunday night. Fed Chair Jerome Powell came forward and said that he is under investigation by the Department of Justice. Now, the contours of exactly what this all entails are still evolving as we speak, but I think it's worth saying this out loud, number one, and going back to a couple of basics. The first is, this is genuinely shocking. Powell is a famously thoughtful, measured figure in a lot of ways, whether you agree with him or not. So to see him in that video coming out swinging like that, I was floored.
This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
Trump and Powell have had a lot of tension for years, but what surprised me in that video was the timing and the tone. Very clearly, this is a situation that isn't actually just about Powell himself, I would argue, but about the Fed as an institution, and probably about the independence of Powell's eventual successor. It's worth also talking about this in the context of the private markets. VCs in particular, who I talk to, will often say, yes, what the Fed does doesn't really affect us because it's long-term. We are investing on such long time horizons. To which I say the long-term stability of the United States economy actually does matter. And if we get to the place where the Fed is responding to short-term political pressures, that fundamentally changes the economy in ways that affect every single investor and every single startup ultimately. Now, in a more fun piece of news, this week I published an inside look at Strava. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Strava is a fitness tracking app.
They say it's about discipline. I think it's about routines.
That has a long history, but actually is en route to going public. I had a really interesting conversation with the CEO, Mike Martin, who's been the CEO for about 2 years, about the company's turnaround and how in certain ways Strava was brought back to life, brought back into this new era by female Gen Z runners. And it's the sort of thing that when Strava does go public, they officially won't comment, of course. But when that day does come, it will be a tech IPO, but it will also be an IPO at the intersection of a lot of trends around wellness, which I think are going to be a bigger story in 2026 than we even know right now. And that's the news for this week. Now, in an interview recorded at Brainstorm AI, here's Jenny Xiao, founder of Leonis Capital. Jenny, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Jenny, I am so excited you're here. You've seen AI from so many different perspectives, as an academic, as a researcher at OpenAI, and now as an investor. A lot of people are really worried about the existential risks. What is your take on balancing innovation with safety?
I actually think this is a topic that's not being discussed enough in Silicon Valley. I mean, there are small pockets of researchers here and there, especially at OpenAI and Anthropic, that are thinking about existential risk, but I think it is largely contained within those small communities and not discussed enough in big tech, in the startups, and also in the VC ecosystem. No one really talks about it.
So it's kind of niche right now.
I think it is more niche than it should be, but I think it really should be one of the top 3 topics that the broader AI community talks about. And I think the way that, we handle AI safety very responsibly first comes from the foundation model labs, because these labs face a lot of competitive pressure from each other to release products really quickly. And oftentimes a lot of products are released without proper safety testing. We've seen, really terrible results previously from Google, Gemini, very early days of AI. And then later with Grok, when Grok is doing all sorts of crazy things and saying racist stuff. And I think a lot of AI labs are pressured to release their models faster and faster because of market expectations without properly testing those models for safety. And then from an application perspective, I really think VCs and startup founders should pay a lot of attention to safety. And safety here really means that we're handling customer data responsibly and also, adhering to AI regulations.
Well, it's the sort of thing, too, that part of what you're saying, it sounds like, is that the pace of change is not just about the technology itself. It's about the competition that's happening between top labs, in part.
No, absolutely. I think there is, well, Anthropic always says that if they're the best player in AI safety, there might be, a race to the top eventually, because if they set the safety standards and everyone's going to want to imitate them. But we're seeing there's actually a race to the bottom happening in terms of safety standards, because a lot of the newer labs, especially like Grok and XAI, they're releasing models really, really fast without even testing them sometimes.
With sometimes radical consequences.
Yes, radical consequences. And I think the AI labs in China are also releasing their models super, super quickly. And they're not necessarily that concerned about AI safety or like doing a proper safety test before releasing.
What do really good safeguards look like in AI?
That's a very hard to define thing, because you also always have to be careful about safeguards, because a lot of people have complained about AI models becoming quote unquote dumber if you have too many safeguards. And if you safeguard a model in a wrong way, it might have other consequences that are not predictable.
Like what?
I remember listening to, Dario talk about this on another podcast. Like he's a CEO of Anthropic, and he says that he has a lot of Anthropic users asking him, hey, can we just make Grok respond in a certain way? Can we inject a certain prompt into Claude,
Yeah.
and make it do a certain thing? But he's like, and large language models are very unpredictable, so you can't just say like, hey, don't talk about this, and it's just going to completely filter it out. It's going to have like a lot of negative consequences that are unpredictable.
When you think about the role academics have to play in this, like I was thinking about nuclear earlier today, for example, a situation where academics played a key role. What role are academics currently playing in AI, in the conversations around where AI is going?
I think the biggest role that academics are playing is educating the next generation of AI researchers. And this is where all of the AI talent comes from, right? Very few people go into AI and say that, hey, I'm just going to become an AI researcher without going through an academic program, either an undergraduate or, postdoc, PhD program. So I think academics play a huge role in doing that. And also we're seeing a lot of professors come out with startups, like Fei-Fei Li, for example, started World Labs, and a lot of Stanford professors are coming up with startups in AI, in robotics. And we think increasingly you're going to see professors and academics come up as startup founders. But overall, I think academics are playing a smaller role in AI today than they were like 10 years ago. And the main reason is that academia doesn't have the resources for model training. And this is something that the AI community has been talking about for a really long time. I remember reading this thing from one of the Anthropic's co-founders, Jack Clark's blog many years ago, when he was talking about how academia just doesn't have GPUs for doing large-scale AI training and also for doing experiments. And his proposal there was, why don't we create like a national GPU cluster and give it out to academia and nonprofits, so for them to like be able to do frontier AI research, because right now the amount of research that you can do in academia is relatively limited, and most of it's limited by GPU resources.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like part of what you're saying is that academics play a key role educating the next generation, but also a lot of people drop out of their PhD programs to go join one of the frontier labs where they actually have compute, which creates a situation where a lot of the frontier research, or all of it pretty much, is happening at private companies.
That's largely true. I think there's still a lot of theoretical work that can be done in academia, but outside of theoretical work or like small scale research, you can't really do large scale experiments or train large models in academia. And I think that's the biggest challenge that academia faces nowadays. But you go to any academic institution, especially the elite ones, almost all the professors and the PhDs there are affiliated with private industry in one way or another. And I think this in large part shapes their research agenda as well. So it's almost like, hey, you have all these professors and researchers go after the same research directions because this is what the private sector says is important. This is what people are willing to fund. And I think that's not necessarily the best dynamic we want to see in academia.
Now tell me about your trajectory, because you started as an academic. Tell us about your PhD. Like, what was your dissertation on?
Yeah, so I did a PhD specifically focusing on economics and AI. So a little bit of like econ, a little bit of like CS, AI, and specifically I was really interested in game theory and AI alignment. Since I got into AI back in the very early days of LLMs back in 2017.
What was the world for LLMs like then? Like, paint us a picture.
Well, this is when the initial LLMs were coming out, and at the time, the hottest thing wasn't the LLM. People were talking about LSTMs. People were talking about other types of
What's an LSTM?
So it's another model architecture. You don't need to know what it is. This
Don't
is
worry
like
about
ancient
it.
history.
This is ancient. This is an ancient LLM. It's a fossil.
Yeah, and the hot models back in the day were computer vision models and reinforcement learning models. And at the time, right, I became very involved in the AI safety community and actually ended up working for the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University for a summer. And then I became really immersed in the world of AI safety and became really interested in what AI safety means. And that inspired me to want to do a PhD related to this area. And specifically, I was really interested in how do you create incentives for AI, which is why I went into econ and specifically focused on game theory, because game theory is all about how actors interact with each other and also how you create incentives and structures for actors to behave. And that's an area that I was very, very curious about when I was a PhD student.
And what about the transition to OpenAI? How did that happen?
It's a very interesting story. I actually left my PhD after the first year to join OpenAI full time. And then
Was it one of these stories where you wanted compute?
Well, in large part, yes, because I thought that academia is just so much behind real industry, and I really wanted to have an impact on the AI industry and especially in AI safety. And that's what inspired me to leave academia and join an industry lab. And then OpenAI and DeepMind were two of my top choices at the time. Ended up going with OpenAI. It really pissed off my mom because she was like, "Oh, you're leaving a really good academic program to go to this,
You're
tiny
a dropout now."
little nonprofit in the Mission District in San Francisco." She was very pissed about it at the time.
Because this is 2017.
No, this is 2021.
2021. Okay, but ChatGPT still hasn't come out.
Yeah.
Oh. So you started OpenAI. What were you working on there? What did you learn there?
Yeah, I mostly focused on benchmarking large language models. Benchmarking and evals was the main thing that I was working on. Specifically, I was looking at Chinese language models at the time. So large language models that dealt with Chinese language, not just English language. So that was the main thing that I was looking at.
Now there's a world of people who are founders who are like, "Oh, I did 6 months at OpenAI, so now I can go found a company, or I can go be a VC." But that wave hadn't started yet at all back then. What you were doing is probably pretty unique. Did people look at you like you were crazy?
I think so. At the time, right? I had a lot of friends who asked me, "Why did you leave? Why did you specifically leave the research world for venture?" I think that was the question people were asking me the most, and not "Hey, why did you leave OpenAI?" Because a lot of my friends who left OpenAI ended up working for Anthropic, because that was the early days of Anthropic as well. And I would say my research fit would be a good fit for Anthropic, just because there's a lot of overlap in what the two labs are doing. But I think I made a career decision that's very different than a lot of my friends who ended up working for another big lab. But I just decided to do something else altogether.
If you had to distill it down, why didn't you want to work for another big lab?
I think fundamentally, I'm pretty entrepreneurial. I wanted to really own something and really have the ability to shape an institution. And when I was at OpenAI, I really felt that hey, this is a really amazing organization, but I'm still sort of a cog in a wheel. I don't really want to say that because it's a research lab and it was a small company. It's not like Google or Meta or any of the 30,000 person companies, but it was still
it's getting there now.
It is getting there, which is why I probably wouldn't have liked myself if I stayed there for another 3 years.
What has most surprised you about OpenAI's trajectory since you've left?
I think the biggest change, and I've actually written about this. I wrote a whole article about this, which is OpenAI is transitioning from a research lab to a platform company. OpenAI wants to be the everything platform for the US. It almost wants to be WeChat for the US, and it's one of the few companies in Silicon Valley that has that kind of ambition, because the vast majority of Silicon Valley companies wants to do one thing and one thing very well, and OpenAI is going on after consumer and shopping and APIs and enterprise, and it's going after all these different directions. And I think it's going to face a lot of competition in a lot of these directions. But at the same time, it's probably going to become the platform company of this decade.
I was going to say the other thing too, there's so much talk around OpenAI. What do you think people most misunderstand about working there?
Well, I think when people think about OpenAI, they think about it as OpenAI today, right? And I think the biggest thing is that like it's very different working there in the early days versus working there today. In the early days, people were taking like a huge pay cut just to go work for OpenAI because this is like, nonprofit. It was very idealistic. There's a lot of focus on safety. And today it's a lot about, hey, my total comp is like 3 million at OpenAI, right? So it's a very different culture today compared with like 3-4 years ago and before ChatGPT went viral. But I think this kind of like transition happens like in every single organization. If you want to go from like niche to mainstream, you always attract a larger following. So I think when people were saying like, wow, did you get a huge comp when you were working at OpenAI? I was like, no, it's a lot lower than Google in the early days.
You're sitting there, you're like, I was not being paid millions of dollars, I promise. Tell me a little bit about your strategy. You describe it as research driven. What does that actually mean?
So the inspiration for the research-driven strategy comes from my experience working as an AI researcher. So basically what I found is that there's a massive disconnect between what researchers are seeing and what investors are seeing. What we're talking about today here at Fortune AI or at all these business conferences is at least 3 to 5 years behind what researchers are thinking about. And it's crazy. You don't look at me like that, but it is crazy. But we are so behind the technical frontier, and that's the gap that I really wanted to bridge. And I really believe that with AI, there needs to be a new generation of founders. There needs to be a new generation of VCs. And this is the first time in the last like 20 years that VCs have to underwrite not just the market, but also the technology. Like SaaS companies were built on a very stable tech stack that doesn't really move, right? Your infrastructure provider doesn't threaten to absorb you. But now you have all these LLMs that might build your company into a feature in ChatGPT. And this is the first time in the last 20 years that VCs have to underwrite not just the market, but also the technology. And we think that because of that, you're going to have a new generation of VCs as well. And this is, and this generation of VCs will have to be as technical as the founders themselves.
So what are researchers talking about that we're not talking about right now?
They're going into like all sorts of details about scaling, about data, about reinforcement learning, about multimodal, all those like really, really nuanced and very technical questions that we're not really talking about as business observers.
What is one of the things that you think every business observer here who's going to be watching this podcast needs to understand about the frontier of where AI is at right now?
I think the biggest thing that business observers should know is that AI progress isn't linear. A lot of business observers just assume that AI progress is going to happen like in a very linear way, but in reality, AI progress happens in lumps. You have a new model architecture, you have a new training run, you have a new way of doing things, and suddenly you get like a big bump, right? It happens like periodically. And that's why it doesn't really make sense for you to say like, hey, why is AI progress slowing down? Or why is it happening so quickly? Because I think business observers will say two things about AI progress. They'll either say like, oh, it's happening so quickly that, AI today is like so different from AI 2 years ago. Or they'll say like, hey, it's happening so slowly that we haven't seen any progress since GPT-4. So, I think it's neither of those two extremes. It's somewhere in between. And the reality is AI progress happens in little lumps.
Now, you've previously talked about the role your Asian American identity has played in your career as an AI researcher and now as an investor. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have
kind of a contrarian take.
Yes, I have a very contrarian take. I'm actually Chinese American, and you can tell by my last name. I actually think there's a huge advantage in being Asian American, and specifically in being Chinese American if you want to be in the AI industry. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, there's discrimination, there's like all the political stuff that's happening. But I think the advantage comes from the fact that AI is very, very heavily Chinese. You go to any AI conference, you go to NeurIPS, you go to like, Triple AI, you go to any of these AI conferences, I would say like 60% of people have Chinese last names. I don't want to assume people's nationalities, but like 60% of people have Chinese last names. And I always joke that if I just go in, with my Chinese name, I would just blend in perfectly. And I would say that being, just being Chinese or being Chinese American in AI is a huge advantage, just because like you will have a network of AI researchers like within your circle like pretty easily. And my hot take here is actually that the AI race between the US and China is really a race between Chinese and China and, Chinese and Chinese Americans in the US, right? So the tiger moms are doing something right here.
That's such a hot take, but also sort of to this point, what do you think Americans in particular misunderstand about AI in China?
I think people always think that there's like a 6 to 9 month gap, or even like longer than that, between Chinese models and the frontier US models. And people always think that that gap's going to be there for the long run, right? Because, we have more resources, we have more GPUs.
They're assuming a steady state.
Yes, exactly. We have just, more. But I think the reality is that the Chinese labs are growing really, really quickly because they iterate really quickly, and also because they have a lot of unique data as well. Like I know a lot of Chinese labs are paying mathematicians from Tsinghua and Peking University to do data labeling for them. And the cost for doing that kind of high-end data labeling is a lot cheaper in China than here in the US. Because, how can you pay someone, say, $30 an hour and do mathematical labeling for you, right? That's just, that's unimaginable if you're in the US. It's a lot more expensive than that. And then also there's a lot of distillation happening in the Chinese labs as well. People don't like to talk about it, but I know for a fact that like almost all the Chinese frontier model labs are to some degree distilling American AI models, and it's very, very hard for the American companies to stop them. And that's another reason why the gap between the US and China is like decreasing pretty quickly. And I would say like don't assume a steady state. I would actually predict that in 2026 the feature velocity coming from open source models is going to exceed closed source models, and you're going to see models in China ship new features, and then OpenAI and Anthropic are catching up and copying them.
Sort of for our audience, actually, what is distillation?
So distillation basically means that you use OpenAI's chatbot or Anthropic's chatbot, right? You ask ChatGPT a bunch of questions and you say like, hey, what's the distance between Earth and the moon? And then you get all these answers and use those answers to train a smaller model. And in that way, you kind of absorb all the knowledge from the bigger model.
Remember when DeepSeek came out? You were one of many people I called being like, what's going on here? One of the things I found really interesting about that moment was the absolute shock. Do you think we're in for another DeepSeek moment?
I actually think there's a lot of new models that have come out that exceeded the performance of DeepSeek, but because we had the DeepSeek shock already, we're not as shocked about it yet. I think the next DeepSeek moment will be the moment where you see an open source Chinese model exceed the performance of the state-of-the-art American model, because the DeepSeek moment was DeepSeek overtaking OpenAI's O1 model, but O1 was already like a last generation model for OpenAI, so there was still like a 6 to 9 month gap between DeepSeek and frontier OpenAI models. But I think the next moment is going to be like Quinn or DeepSeek or whatever model in China really exceeding, say, GPT-5 or Claude, Claude 4. I don't even know, 4.3 or 4 point whatever. And then people are going to be really, really shocked when that happens.
What does that look like when that day comes? Do you think it changes anything we do on the ground here? Do you think it speeds up that pace we were talking about? What do you think happens? Let's play out the scenario for a second.
I think what's going to happen from a foundation model company perspective is that they're really going to rethink their whole API business. And that's actually one of my predictions for 2026, just because the gap between open source and closed source is closing so quickly that the foundation model companies are going to rethink whether the API business is a good business to be in the long run. Just because if companies are able to use a model that's like almost as intelligent as like Claude or ChatGPT, like what's the point of like calling the OpenAI API and paying like a 10x, 20x premium for a closed source model? And I think that day is happening. It's going to happen like very, very soon. And then it's very hard for the foundation model companies to perpetually maintain a lead over open source. And then from a policy perspective, I actually think that's going to be when the U.S. really tightens export controls and tries all sorts of ways to, limit China's AI progress. And this could mean banning GPU exports, banning, all sorts of like GPU manufacturing equipment and anything related to like compute or AI.
So it could facilitate a business model shift and a broader geopolitical shift, essentially. It could be that big of a deal.
I think so. I think it's going to be a real shocker when it happens.
Now, let's talk about the AI bubble. You think there's a bubble, right? We've talked about this. The question is, how big is the bubble?
I think before we talk about the AI bubble, I would like to think about what is an AI bubble. And essentially, an AI bubble is when there's a gap between value and valuation. Now, a lot of people say that there is an AI bubble, but I think the big issue is no one tells me exactly how you should value AI companies, because AI companies aren't supposed to be valued at zero. So when you say that there's a bubble, it's very intellectually lazy for you to say, oh, there's a bubble, but you don't really tell me how much you should value the AI companies. Now,
what would the valuation be like if it wasn't a bubble?
Yes, exactly. And one of the concepts that we introduced in one of our research pieces is called the zero value threshold. And basically what this means is that when AI companies cross a certain threshold, their enterprise value goes to zero. For foundation model companies, this basically means that if they're overtaken by the best open source model, that their whole business goes down, right? We've seen this happen to a lot of second tier foundation model companies over the last couple of years where they're not as good as the open source models and therefore they go to zero. And we've seen this happen to application layer companies as well when their whole business gets absorbed by OpenAI or, Anthropic or any of the foundation model companies. So that's where the zero value threshold kicks in for AI businesses. And what this means is that because there's a zero value threshold, AI businesses should not be valued as expensively as SaaS. It should actually be valued cheaper than SaaS. The multiples should be lower for SaaS because there's a zero value threshold. Now, aside from that, there's a couple of other factors that also points to the direction that AI should be valued lower than SaaS. And this is essentially that AI companies, they look like software in the front end, but they're actually utility businesses in the back end. Because if you're selling SaaS, the marginal cost of shipping another SaaS product is zero, but the marginal cost of shipping another AI product is not zero. And this basically means that AI products are not as scalable as software products, and they're also not as sticky as software products because competition is so fierce. So
you're one of the only people I've ever heard say anything even remotely like this.
So essentially, well, thank you. So essentially, you take all that together, it means that AI should be trading at a lower multiple than SaaS, right? But now what we're seeing is that SaaS is trading at 20 to 30x multiples. AI is trading at 40 to 50x multiples and sometimes even higher. But from our perspective, AI should be trading at like a 30% discount compared to SaaS. And this means that the bubble is probably a 2x. Now, does this mean that we should not invest in AI? No, I think we should absolutely invest in AI because if you're here for a 10-year game, it doesn't really matter if it's, 2x more expensive. If you're going to be here for 10 years, your assets are going to, appreciate 10x, and then the 2x difference becomes almost a rounding error. And I think that's what a lot of long-term investors are thinking.
I was going to say, for you, you're sitting there looking at a company. How many companies do you see a year at this point, give or take?
Like thousands. We see a lot.
You see a lot. You're looking at a company and you think you might be interested in investing. How do you think about valuation for yourself, for your size fund?
Yeah, interesting question. I think oftentimes as VCs, we don't really get to dictate the valuation unless we're leading, unless, a lot of things come into place, or else we don't really get to dictate pricing, right? Because if you offer a valuation that's too low, then the founder is going to go to another fund. So I would say it's always the market deciding the price and not like us as VCs dictating what the price is, which means that our job is to pick the best founders and not too crazy of a valuation, but we don't get to dictate the valuation and say like, hey, we want to invest in you at a crazy valuation because the founders will just,
Yeah, I mean, if you're one of the large multi-stage funds, you come in and say, this is the biggest number I will pay, and sometimes that will dictate a valuation.
Actually, no, because between the big name funds, if Sequoia offers a company a term sheet and says, hey, you're worth like $50 million, and the founder's like, oh no, I'm worth at least like 100, they'll go to like another fund. They'll go to A16Z.
Yeah, and A16Z will then pay it.
Yes.
Interesting. I mean, so for you, As you're sort of thinking about what you wouldn't do, like what is something that's just a red flag for you in a company?
I think a big red flag is when a company that's, it comes out, no product, no nothing, just narrative, and they're raising at a really, really high valuation. I would say that's a big red flag for me, but I wouldn't just say like, oh, because, a company is 50%, maybe like 20% higher than my ideal valuation, I would immediately pass on those companies. Because I think in venture, we're here for a 10-year game, right? We're not here for like 2 quarters or 3 quarters, because yes, I think there's going to be a market correction over the next like 12 months. But if you're in the right assets, they're going to appreciate pretty dramatically over the next 10 years. And I wouldn't, regret investing in a company that like becomes 100x bigger just because the entry price is like 2x higher than my ideal.
You actually just said something interesting. Next 12 months, you said?
I think so. Yeah.
Next 12 months, you think there's going to be a reckoning? What are you imagining?
I think people are going to realize that AI companies' multiples should be closer to SaaS, maybe not lower than SaaS, but like closer to SaaS than like, significantly higher than SaaS. Like I think, a medium-sized market correction is valuing AI companies around SaaS multiples. And then I think a really, really, strict correction would be like, hey, you're valued slightly below SaaS multiples.
Now, when you think about the race between the largest labs, who do you think's in the lead? And what does that actually mean even?
Well, I think it's going to be very hard to evaluate who has a technical lead, because I hear a lot of people say Gemini 3 is in the lead. It's the best model. I use Gemini 3. It's like marginally better than GPT-5. And as a user, I probably wouldn't switch to Gemini just because it's slightly better, because OpenAI has so much of my data. I think there's a lot of ways of measuring where the lead is. You can say like, oh, the lead is about raw model performance, but no one really cares about that outside of AI research. No one cares about benchmarks. No one cares about who has the most intelligent model. We're past that stage. We're at the stage where people care about user experience. And I think the lead should really come from who has users, who's able to like retain them, who has enterprises. Are the enterprises happy about them? I think the raw like AI capability race is over, and I think whoever like thinks that we're still in a capabilities race is deluding themselves. I think the next phase of AI is really about how do we make AI work for everyone. However, I would say there's a caveat here. If someone comes up with a new model architecture and a totally new way of doing things that makes the AI improvement non-marginal, I would say that's pretty meaningful.
This has happened a bunch of times. A new model comes out from Insert Lab here, and everyone's like, well, it's only a little bit better. There are marginal gains. What you're saying is, yeah, I mean, the tech press might care, researchers might care, but nobody actually cares.
Well, you ask enterprises, do you care? Do you look at benchmarks? Do you care that like GPT-5 is marginally better than Claude on this or that benchmark? No one cares. They care about user experience. And as like an individual consumer, I don't really care if Gemini 3 is like, like a little bit better than GPT-5. Like GPT has all my data, and that's who I'm going to go to for like, questions about what's a dish I should cook? Like, where should I go to vacation? Like, those are very basic questions that you don't really need the frontier models to answer.
When you think about the business models of a lot of these companies, which business models are working and which ones would you as an investor say, absolutely not, I want nothing to do with that?
I think by and large, the foundation model companies have already figured out their business models. I would say enterprise is a better business model than consumer, because OpenAI is probably one of the only AI consumer businesses that are making money. All of the other businesses that are selling to consumers are massively subsidizing their consumers. And this includes Lovable, this includes Cursor, whoever like sells to individuals and expects an individual to pull out a credit card and pay for it. They're massively subsidizing these users because individuals don't have the capital or the willingness to pay. I think by, ChatGPT actually did something really bad for the industry, which is like putting a price on AI to $20, and you can never deviate from that price. And that's why all the AI models, all the AI products are priced at $20. But this means that the model providers and the product providers are losing massive money on consumers. So I think the good business model is selling to enterprises at a massive markup to the API price. I think a bad business model is subsidizing your consumers.
2026. You shared some predictions here. If there is one thing you are absolutely confident will happen in 2026 around AI, what is it?
I think the thing that I'm very confident about is that the whole AI agent hype is going to go away. And what's going to replace that is AI workflows. And by workflows, I really mean very predictable, very well-defined workflows. Basically, like they streamline certain business functions. Instead of like, oh, we're going to do AI agents that act as employees for your businesses. We saw that hype coming back in 2023 when AI became capable of doing tasks. And we were like, AI agents are going to be the future. But at the time, we're very, concerned about the AI agent hype. A lot of people say, oh, we're an agent first company. We're doing things in a very agentic way, but no one wants AI employees. People want AI to do things in a very well-defined way. And I think the next generation of AI startups that are successful in selling to enterprises and also to verticals are going to look much more like SAP than like, three really smart researchers hacking together something that's like AGI.
So agent hype is going to die.
I think so. I think it's going to die in 2026. And I think this is going to be the year where the broader market realizes that. And you're going to see fewer AI startups market themselves as agent companies.
Jenny, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is exciting.
And that was Jenny. So my theory on Jenny is pretty simple. I think she's one of the most nuanced thinkers about valuation in this particular marketplace. In short, one of her key points is this: the marginal cost of selling a SaaS product and shipping it is effectively zero. That's why SaaS margins are so famously great. Whereas in AI, that's actually not true at all. Even if there is scalability, the marginal cost of shipping an AI product is never going to be zero. And that is because of compute, which can become a black hole effectively. In short, compute is the great battleground of the future in certain ways, and that battle is only going to get more intense throughout 2026. That's it for Term Sheet. I'm Allie, and I'll see you soon.
Term Sheet is a Fortune magazine podcast. Our producer-editor is Allison Rogers. Our executive producer is Lydia Randall. Our production manager is Sam Freund. Fortune's head of video is Adam Bannicky.